My first advice is that the most important thing about writing a book is actually finishing the book, which I think can be difficult because a lot of writers, myself included, are perfectionists, and perfectionism is our worst enemy in that I tend to find that one reason why I'm reluctant to write is because the book that is on the page will never match the book that lives in your mind as a writer. So it's important to keep in mind that if you never finish a book, you will never have a book to improve upon. And I once heard the really good advice that it's okay for first drafts to be bad, and that, in fact, I've heard from many of my favorite authors that their first drafts are never very good. But the important thing is just to finish it so that you can then go on to edit it and make it better. But if you never create the book, you will never have that foundation to work with. One writer, I think, used a sandcastle metaphor, which is that the first draft is just piling up a bunch of sand, which you can then form into a castle when you're editing. But you cannot make a castle if you do not have any sand. So that advice always stuck with me. And that's always something that I keep in mind when I'm working on my own first drafts, which are always imperfect and always have flaws that I'm self-conscious about. My second writing advice is about editing. And my advice when it comes to editing is don't be afraid to cut material out of your work. I think there's a common saying in writing that you have to be ready to kill your darlings, which I actually don't think that's true. I think that you need to be willing to set aside your darlings, perhaps for later, because nothing that you write or nothing that you cut from your manuscript is ever truly gone. You can always reuse it for future work, and I usually do myself. If I cut a line that I really like, or I cut a character or an idea, I almost always end up coming back to it in some form in my later work. And one thing that I think that I often did myself and that I see a lot of other writers do with their manuscripts is that they have a lot of good ideas, really good ideas, and they try really hard to fit all of those ideas into one book. And the result is that the book has too many ideas, too many characters, or too many subplots or world-building concepts like different types of magic or a very large, expansive world, when perhaps the novel would be more focused if they just took one or two or three of those really good ideas and maybe trimmed some of the rest out to use later. So that personally would have been, if I could go back in time and tell myself any advice about editing, that would be what I would tell myself, because I did write one book before my published novel, An Enchantment of Ravens. And it was just an example of me sort of trying to throw every single good idea that I had into it. And then when I was editing, I didn't want to cut any of those ideas because they were so precious to me and I loved them so much. But I will tell you that that manuscript is now on the shelf and it's never going to be published. But I have reused many of the ideas from that book in my later works. So nothing is ever truly gone as a writer. My third piece of advice is about characters. I find that one of the things that tends to go wrong the most often with my books is that character interactions will begin to feel inauthentic, or the dialogue will begin to feel forced. And that's the point at which I realize I need to sort of pause and spend some time working on the character dynamics and the characters' development. And I often find what is really helpful for me when I'm building characters is I will write a character sheet and I will just start listing what are the things that have happened in this character's life that has influenced them as a person. This also helps if you are in a situation where your characters feel too similar to each other. You start feeling like their dialogue is too similar or their personalities are too similar and they're sort of blending together. It can really help to spend some time figuring out what are their driving motivations, what has affected them as a person, what has affected their sense of ethics, their relationships with other people. Do they have reason to mistrust other people because bad things have happened to them? Or are they overly trusting of other people because they've had a sheltered life or they've had a really happy upbringing? You'll find that these kinds of choices influence their dialogue. You know, what sort of education have they had? And one thing that I think is of ultimate importance is that you want the character to have changed in some way meaningfully by the end of the book. So I always try to, take the ending of the book and think, how has this impacted them? What kind of person were they at the beginning of the book versus the end of the book? And what sort of development have they undergone that directly ties with the plot and the world building of the story? Because you don't want your character to be static from beginning to end. Even if they're a side character, I find that it brings a lot of life to the character to have them change throughout the course of the novel. And another random tip that I personally find really helpful that other writers have enjoyed is that when I'm first starting to work on a project, I will make a really long list of character names so that when you're in the middle of drafting or editing and you realize, oh, I need to put in this character really quickly, I need to insert a side character, but you don't want to pause and go on the internet and go down a rabbit hole of looking up names and then getting distracted from writing for 2 hours. It really helps to have a list of names that are appropriate to the setting. And then you can just go down and scroll down and choose from your list of names for just some random side character. My fourth piece of advice pertains to world building. This is just something that I do personally, so it doesn't need to be, and of course any advice that any writer ever gives you, you should take with a grain of salt. You should not take it as law or anything of that nature, because every writer does write differently. So what works for you may not work for someone else. So of course, everything I say to you is just my personal experience or preference. But when I'm working on world building, what I like to do, and I think this helps me a little bit as sort of a trick or a shortcut with world building, is that I try to make the protagonist have some sort of special relationship with the world or the magic system, not in the sense that they are a special person, like a special chosen one, but in the sense that they have a unique relationship with that world, the world that they inhabit, because then you can sort of develop the world and the character alongside each other, which is a trick for building worlds where you don't seem like you are info dumping on the reader, because the character has such a close relationship with the world, or develops one perhaps as they are finding things out about themselves, that it is personal rather than sort of dry information that you are imparting upon the reader. An example of this might be in my first novel. The main character is a portrait artist in a setting where the fairies, the fair folk, cannot create anything. So they are her patron because they crave artwork, they crave human craft. So that positions the main character in a situation where she often has to interact with the fair folk. She has to learn their rules of interaction. And it provides an opportunity for the story to get started rather than her just being someone who has a random encounter with one of the fair folk, for example. So that's something that I always use as a trick when I am first developing a world, is to figure out how to get the protagonist engaged with the world.